would like to introduce our research paper about constraint consistency checking in distributed enterprise systems, for which we performed a systematic mapping study. I am Tomas Cerny, I'm from Baylor University, and I present this group of authors. So, outline to this presentation, a little bit of discussion about distributed versus monolith systems, what are enterprise systems. There might be mention about code analysis, and then about our mapping study with research questions, analysis of results, research question answers, and conclusion. So distributed systems have an issue compared to monolith systems with missing type safety, and this pretty much gives us potential for introducing an error, whether it is domain rule, input validation, some security policy, or some constraints on data. Simply the systems interact and they exchange data, and on both sides they have to maintain some of those rules and restrictions. And what if those two restrictions, those two sides that communicate, do not match? Then of course it runs in an inconsistency. An example could be that we would send some package with data, and this data is truncated, not even knowing about that, because that one side has a size limitation. Another example, which is very common, is that we have a distributed system that has two endpoints that do the same thing. For instance, one is interfacing our user interface, and another one is facing REST calls that anyone could do through a web service. And in that perspective, we have two entrances to the system, and if we improperly enforce some consistency, or later throughout the maintenance process we update some rules on one side only, then the other side is still open to the previous version of constraints on the data, and we can enter to the system that something that is not expected. And this is an issue, and we are looking in the study if there are some approaches that could identify this. So how do we detect inconsistencies in general? It's a manual review process, part of quality assurance, where someone is actually checking two systems towards compatibility. And this is a very tedious and error-prone process, so we are pretty much looking for some automation. Then we mention enterprise systems simply because they have some sort of rules. Most likely these are going to be three-tier architecture systems with three layers: persistence, business logic, and presentation. And this is pretty much well maintained. Of course, if we have a middleware, there is not the presentation layer, it ends with the endpoints. Typically, enterprise systems built on top of components. So if you imagine enterprise development framework, there are various types of components, again, for persistence, for business logic, or for presentation. And they have been introduced many development standards. So for instance, Java Enterprise Edition has Java Persistence API, input bean validation, security API, and standards for endpoints, and many other things. And code analysis seems to be like the fit to do something automatically. In our perspective, we would like to analyze the code and pretty much see the inconsistencies. However, in this study, we are looking in what everyone else has been doing so far. But graphical representation seems to be something that could use for our code to match whether the distinct part of the distributed systems match or not. So another mention we make is a microservice architecture. Why? Because you can see the growing popularity. This is the architecture for cloud-friendly solutions, like stateless architecture and so on. And we include microservice architecture in our search. Pretty much it is the direction that we would like to go to auto-scale systems. If we had monolithic system, it doesn't scale well because we have to scale the whole system, even though just one feature might be demanded. Microservices have better granularity. At the same time, there are many frameworks that push forward this sort of approach. So most likely you are familiar with containers such as Docker or container orchestration like Kubernetes. These are the hottest technologies perhaps on the current market. So regarding the consistency in distributed applications, so we are looking in the enterprise context. That means we would like to assess the literature, find out the best practice, and our direction is to look for the ACM, look into the IEEE, SpringerLink, and ScienceDirect to see what we can find. How did we form our query? Well, so pretty much we would like to compose some sort of question which we highlight in the sentence here. Constraint consistency checking in distributed systems. However, there is a variability of words that we can find across literature that we are aware of. So we extend each colored part with multiple other words. We cannot go into indefinite number because, for instance, ScienceDirect has a limitation on how many of the keywords we could use. So as an alternative to constraint, we could also say rule, property, policy, or security, simply because we believe security is one of the most important things. For the consistency, it could also be inconsistency or compliance. For the checking, it could be verification, enforcement, detection, or avoidance. And instead of distributed systems only, we are also interested in something that is in enterprise, and in particular cloud and microservices. We could possibly include other things, but these are outside of the scope of what we are trying to do in the paper. So our findings. So the rough numbers that we received from all those indexers gave us 436 papers, which is a huge number. However, when we manually looked through the papers, and we paid attention mostly to the metadata, which is abstract, title, and also the keywords. That was the primary focus. If we were unsure, we would also look to the entire content. We identified only 15 papers that are somehow related to the particular search we have made. We formed 4 research questions. First is about the taxonomy of the research direction, about techniques on the constraint consistency checking, existing tools, and also if we could identify some of the open challenges and perhaps gaps. And of course, it implies opportunities that there are for the research. So these are the categories that we have identified mostly from those 15 papers. Security, most of the work that we have found. Property-based testing, business processes, constraints in multibases, in databases. However, we try to avoid looking into databases since it's just a one single part of the 3-tier architecture, or it is even below that. And then artifact consistency, interesting direction as well. So if you look to the security perspective, what other works have been doing. So for instance, they were looking into role-based access control violations, and they identified common violations that could happen in distributed environment. And in particular, the work we have assessed had very nice formalisms to explain how it should work in a theoretical perspective, and it provided a solution that is multidimensional. So we can pretty much combine multiple modules of distributed systems towards each other in order to verify issues based on the role-based access control. Next paper that we have considered was looking into rule matching strategies. And for instance, where this could happen. Well, anytime we have some rule, we need to verify whether this rule applies somewhere else, and we need to do that quickly. So this particular related work we have been looking into was dealing with identifying conflicts quickly, and it used B3, which is pretty much used in databases in order to quickly recognize that some policy is not matching, some rule is inconsistent. So again, we identified literature that could be very helpful when someone is looking in that particular direction. And why did we classify this under the security? Because in particular, they were looking for some security constraints. Suspicious operation detection in distributed systems, and this has been addressed by 3 different works, and this is related to the runtime. So in real time, we want to find out if there is some operation performed that should not be performed, and they are using machine learning and deep learning. So for instance, long short-term memory, n-grams, or frequencies for identifying whether some of those operations has been should be actually called, or it's something that is suspicious and we should either prevent it or notify some security expert about it. Then another sort of different direction we looked into was considering different implementations of low-level JDK following the same API, and assessing multiple different implementations. They were trying to identify security issues where one of those implementations would probably forgot to do something, or the other implementation did something extra. So those inconsistencies could have been again assessed, and of course they were analyzing the code. And it was another sort of influential work. So what they have done, they have developed an algorithm to create an oracle, and then the oracle would be answering questions whether something is right or not. The other directions, property-based testing, so static checking on correctness, they pretty much were testing that some property of the system is satisfied and would generate automated tests. A rather larger field was business processes, and these were building on top of distributed business processes. They would be using some specifications for those business processes, typically described in some high-level language, just like BPL or some VSDL. And one influential work we have identified was composing multiple services together and certifying them without even testing, and that certification would state that these will be compatible to work together. Constraints in multibases, another interesting direction, exchange of metadata across multiple systems in order to apply and enforce some global constraints and identify violation on the global level. So this would be one direction to move forward when we have distributed modules and we want to find out whether they are compliant. So we extract the meta model. So for instance, does this have a model of person? If so, does it correlate within the fields? Another interesting direction was to checking consistency of documents. So document object model, for instance, that typically described in XML or YAML, such as deployment descriptors. And they were considering two directions, two dimensions pretty much. One, constraints between the artifacts on the same stage. So for instance, we are developing, are the artifacts compliant? And the other direction was between stages of the software development lifecycle, where we would be looking at design and implementation. Are those two things correlating, or are they not? So that was another interesting direction, because it leads us into seeing that it is important to perform those things in the entire software development lifecycle. So now let's get us to the answers, and pretty much what we have been talking about in a couple of previous slides was the taxonomy on what is it we covered. So security, property-based testing, business processes, constraints in multibases, and artifact consistency. So this has been addressed so far, and we can see that it is not much. There could be so much more work done, because it is a very important topic. Next question, what techniques have been used in the constraint consistency? So XML specifications, extracting system oracle from code analysis and deriving some sort of composite model. Meta model perspective, again, building some virtual global model. So this is perhaps the direction that we should be moving forward to. Not only code analysis, but also log analysis and event interception is important here. And maybe looking at the joint perspective is another important direction. So besides code analysis, log analysis is important as well. Especially in the log analysis, we have seen application of n-grams, term frequency, inverse document frequency, the long short-term memory neural networks, which are there for the real-time checking that something is going wrong. And again, those papers we have identified were very, very motivating in what they were doing. But we can see that it is sort of distinctive from the other works what they have been identifying and working on. So these were checking the policies, that we are violating some sort of policy that is there. And then the data structures we have seen involved were typically graphs, tree structures, so for instance B-tree for the consistency checking. But we also identified Petri networks when the authors of the role-based access control were pretty much checking multiple domains on combinations of the roles that could appear within the given system. Which tools have we found? So we will probably refer you to the particular research paper. And here are some of the tools and links which we have identified. So we can see the log analysis mentioned quite often, but also the artifact synchronization, also some analysis frameworks and property verification and so on. So this is again good thing to have available when we would like to perform some sort of research that is influenced by what, our findings in this paper. And finally, the open challenges and gaps, and this is sort of difficult question. So we can certainly see the growing adoption of microservices, and that means that each microservice is managed by a distinct team, and they don't discuss necessarily the internals with other teams. And as there is evolution, things change, and we are open and we are going to face more and more consistency issues. Log analysis, a very interesting direction, and especially for the runtime. However, the machine learning approaches have limitations. We can identify that something is potential threat, but there are possibly errors with this identification. Maybe we are doing something that is reasonable and we still block it. Static analysis is very common for recognizing something that is an issue, and that's pretty much the conversion into the graphical representation. And when we can see there is not much work that has been done in distributed environments, and we would like to provoke and motivate and stimulate interest in that, and it is also our own interest when we are moving forward with it. So there is virtual global system overlay. In our current research, we are actually extracting system software architecture from enterprise systems, and this research pushed us forward to find out that we have not found many other works working on this. Heterogeneity could be a challenge because there are different frameworks, different languages, different practices, and the graph conversion could perhaps help, especially when we consider the enterprise standard. So if we conclude the small study that we have made, we provide taxonomy of what exists in the research direction, existing approaches, tools, and existing works. And of course, the future progress that we have is IoT, cloud computing, and especially our interest in enterprise systems. How could we optimize, how could we automate this? We would like to thank to NSF for supporting this research that took place in summer, and also to Red Hat Research, who is our partner on pushing forward the progress. And there is one last slide on question and answers, but hopefully we will have a mechanism to respond to you, and especially you will ask us something, we would be more than happy to open discussion with you.